How's it going, guys? So we're going to be doing something a little bit different for this video. As you know, this is primarily and foremost a beer review channel, but beer is not the only thing that I get really enthusiastic about as far as drinking goes. I'm also a really big fan of whiskey, particularly Scotch whiskey. Now, a lot of times when people say they're a whiskey drinker, they usually mean that they enjoy like a whiskey and Coke or some other soda or in a mixed drink or on the rocks or something like that. But it is very much so a real thing, and probably obviously being done much earlier so in history than beer, to really break apart and enjoy and appreciate whiskey. Much like how we do beer reviews on the channel, you can pick apart and write taste notes and remark upon different aspects of whiskey. And I have come to find, and I think it's pretty much a fact, that whiskey in its smells and tastes is much more of a complex drink, really, than beer is. Now, I may be stepping on some toes with that statement, and that may not reign true for all beers versus all types of whiskey, but generally speaking, you can get a much more complex and broad range of smells and tastes from a spirit, especially whiskey, than you can from a beer. So what I wanted to do for this video was do really two things. A, pretty much introduce the new playlist on very rare occasion, because I'm not super well versed in reviewing whiskeys like I am with beers, but on very rare occasion I will do from time to time a whiskey review for you guys. I know all of you probably aren't interested in whiskey, or you may be a whiskey drinker on the side, and this may be cool to you, but as you know, beer and whiskey can really create something harmonious if you age a beer in a whiskey barrel, and I just want something to kind of mix it up and do something a little bit different for you every once in a while. So I figured, why not, from time to time, review a whiskey. I will be trying to review all types of whiskey, bourbons included, but the main focus is going to be on Scotch whiskey. That being said, the second thing I wanted to discuss in this video really is kind of a tutorial, and that's how to enjoy and appreciate whiskey on a level higher than just throwing one back on some ice or Coke mixed in at a bar. So to begin, I think where I want to start is the things that you'll need to get into drinking whiskey, preferably, or main focus on Scotch whiskey once again. The first thing, much like in beer drinking, is having the right glassware. And the good thing is you can usually get away with drinking all your whiskeys from one singular type of glass, unlike in beer, where you have many different types of glass for many different types of beer. So I'll go through some kind of common different things and vessels you see it put in, starting of which with the common tumbler or rock glass. Now, the problem with this type of glass is that the walls are pretty much straight and the rim is pretty much wide, and when you go to smell, a lot of your aromas are leaving and they're not being directed towards the nose. You're getting this little area and everything else is just kind of wafting out. So the shape of this glass and how wide the rim is makes it not really suited for appreciating a whiskey. Another would be something like a square tumbler or a bourbon glass. This is something you'll see a lot of people drinking their bourbons and sometimes scotches on the rocks out of. This may be even worse because it flares out, which is even worse than the other being straight, because this is really redirecting the aromas away from your nose. A really common and popular variant would be something like a brandy snifter. This is a Duvel beer glass, but a brandy snifter may be a little bit smaller than this, but we're in the same vein of things here. Now, this is more like what we're talking about. You have a bowl at the bottom to kind of capture all of your whiskey, and then you have these inward flared sides. It does flare out a little bit at the top, but when you have it Tapering inwards, this does a lot better of a job of directing the aromas to your nose because they're all kind of coming up to this one central point, and you can kind of get your nose down in it and really smell it. The problem with this is, if you're drinking a whiskey to really assess it and appreciate it, you're not going to drink this much of it. When you're going to drink a glass like this much, you're pretty much looking just to get drunk at that point. And it's kind of different, you know. With beer, we're used to cracking open a bottle or even a 22-ounce bomber and going through the whole thing. With whiskey, you only need about a shot glass worth at most to really appreciate it. It's something you want to take your time with and let it kind of sit and breathe in the glass, and we'll go through all of that. So this would work, yes, but it is a little bit big. Now we're going to come to what I would consider to be the perfect vessel and glassware for enjoying whiskey out of, and that is the Glencairn glass. This is a glass that I believe is forged from crystal in Scotland, and it is designed specifically for nosing and appreciating spirits, especially whiskey. And it does this very well. The weighted bottom makes it kind of sit in the hand easy. You can grip it easy. The way that it flares and comes to a very narrow point means you get your nose in, and the circumference of this thing is barely bigger than your nose, so you're getting full flavor and aroma whenever you're smelling, and there is nothing escaping out the sides. Another good point of this is that it's very wieldy in that you can do this with it and not worry about spilling it out of the glass, once again because of how tall it is and the way that the glass tapers, whereas if you're doing that with something like this, you're probably going to spill it out if you have any amount in there at all. So basically, this is what I would consider to be the ideal glass for assessing whiskey with. You can get these on Amazon.com for a very good price. The main thing is just to make sure that you're getting what you're paying for. This is something that is forged a lot. And if you look in the bottom of the glass, you probably will not be able to see this on camera, but there will be text in the bottom that is very tiny, but when held at an angle, kind of like a magnifying glass, you can read it, and it'll say the Glencairn glass, or something to that effect, and that is how you know you have a original on your hands. You can kind of see the text in there. So, proper glassware. What's the second, besides proper glassware, what's the second thing that you need? You need scotch. I have a couple of different bottles that I plan to review over time. This is going to be the one that I plan to review first, not so much in this video, but this is my standby and my favorite scotch, Highland Park 12-year. But yeah, you'll need whiskey, of course, to appreciate your whiskey. Glassware, whiskey, water. This is very important. Whenever you are assessing a whiskey, it is very, very important to put anywhere from a couple of drips to even maybe a whole teaspoon of water, preferably lightly chilled, just cool water, into your whiskey. And this is not like a wussy thing to do, like, oh, I can't handle my whiskey, I need it watered down. No. Whiskey, as it's been said before, water acts like rain on dry ground. It opens up tastes and flavors that you would never have known were there because they are masked behind the intense alcohol burn, both in smell and the taste. When you add just those few drops of water, a magical chemical reaction happens within your whiskey, and it opens up tons of aromas and flavors that you would have never known were there if you had drank it straight. Straight is too hot to appreciate it. It's just alcohol at that point. But you would be amazed at what a few just single drips of water can do when you add them to your whiskey. Now, I said a few drips to a teaspoon. You kind of have to judge with how high the alcohol is. If you have something sitting around 40 to 43, 44%, you only need a few drips. If we're talking like something that is just full-on cask strength in the 50 and 60%, you may need a teaspoon, maybe even a teaspoon and a half to 2 teaspoons of water to really kind of soften the blow of that alcohol a little bit. That being said, a teaspoon or something pretty close to it, because you do not want to put too much water in. If you put too much water in, you can just imagine you water it down and it's not good. really that's all you need to appreciate whiskey. But one final thing that I recommend is keeping taste notes. You can do this on a Word document in your computer if you want to. I prefer to write them down. You could do it in a spiral notebook. It doesn't really matter. But I got this off the internet for very cheap. It is called 33 Drams of Whiskey, and it sets out for you some very easy to follow guidelines and basically makes it easy to keep your notes organized when you're keeping a record of the things that you've tried. So what I want to do now is kind of go into first-person view and explain a couple of the things you could look at with whiskey, and then finally we'll go into pouring it and adding your water, and then we'll move on to the next video, which will be a review. But for now, let's check out this. So here we have it. It has a place on the front for you to put the date that you started your log and the date that you completed it, which whiskey is a expensive commodity most of the time, so it'll probably take you a little bit to finish through it. So here we have it set out. I'll go to a blank page to start. And what you have is, of course, the whiskey name and the distiller. Most of the time, the distiller for Scotch is actually going to be the name of the region it was brewed in sometimes. The age, which is very important for Scotch with bourbon, not necessarily so much. And for blended Scotch whiskey, which we'll get into later. But for a single malt Scotch whiskey, the age is pretty important. The origin, this can tell you a lot about the flavor. If it's a Highland whiskey, a Lowland whiskey, a Speyside whiskey, an Islay whiskey, all these different things can tell you a lot about the flavor. The price, that's a good thing to keep up with. Sample, that's basically just the date that you sampled it on. Your rating, 1 out of 5 stars. On this playlist, I'm probably going to do it 1 out of 100. Then you have your notes, which I'll get into in a second. You have kind of a color meter here, and you have everything from clear to mahogany and everywhere in between, as you can see. And then finally we have something interesting and why I like using this pre-made book. You have a flavor wheel where you can put in the heat and proof, which is basically your proof and your alcohol percentage. And then you have the linger, how long the flavor lasts in the mouth, how much it has on the dark fruit sides of things, citrus fruit, floral, how spicy, herbal, malty, toffee, woody, tannic, or kind of drying, the char, sweetness, the body, and the legs, and the balance. Now, the body and the legs are two things that kind of go hand in hand, which I will also get to in a bit. But to give you an example, let's do Ardbeg Tenure. Ardbeg Tenure is the name of the whiskey. Ardbeg was the distiller. It is a 10-year-old whiskey. The origin is Islay, which means it's going to be quite smoky. Price was $38.99. I sampled this on April 19th of 2014. I gave it a 3 out of 5, and I put this here saying, yes, I would buy it again. The aroma, peat smoke, campfires, ivory soap, and marzipan, and slight green apple. What's interesting is things like glue and ivory soap and medicinal notes are things that you can get in a whiskey that are very much supposed to be there, but they seem kind of foreign if you haven't ever sampled whiskey before. Taste, peat, wood smoke, slightly medicinal, so a very smoky Scotch. And the finish, it had a quick flavor, medium burn, meaning that it burnt the mouth, or the warming effect was medium, and that it finished very quickly. It didn't linger in the mouth for too long. I said that the color was somewhere between clear and straw, and you can kind of see how I have this laid out. Basically, you just put a dot from 0 to maximum of these different aspects, and then you can kind of connect it, and it is called a flavor, I guess, web, really. So that's what it's like to keep taste notes. I will be referencing this whenever I do a Scotch review because there's so many more flavors that it's hard to get them all out in one go doing it live. So now finally, let's take a look at pouring your Scotch, mixing in your water, and how you can judge the body of a whiskey. So I'm going to use, like I said, Highland Park 12 year as my example. We get the cork out. Give it a pour, not much, just probably about right up to here. That is plenty right there. And like I said, when you're adding your water, you just want a couple of drips. So I'm going to dip my spoon in here. Plenty. You would give this a little bit of a swirl, and ideally you'd want to let that sit for anywhere from a couple of minutes to 15 minutes sometimes. It's all about letting the water kind of do its thing and letting it breathe in the glass and seeing how it develops. Now, one thing I should have mentioned to you before I put the water in is testing the body of the whiskey. Obviously, you want to test its viscosity before you put water in it. That was my bad, but we're doing this live, so whatever. And so the way you would do this is you would give the glass a swirl around like so, and then you'd watch the ring that it creates, and you can see all these little drips trickling down into the back into the main bulk of the liquor here. So obviously it's running very fast because it's been watered down a bit, but when you do that without having water in it, something that is fat and slow would suggest more thickness, more viscosity to it, whereas something that is skinny and running very quickly would suggest a thinner mouthfeel to the whiskey. Whiskey is something that can get quite syrupy at times, almost to liqueur, levels. So there you have it. Past that point, it's all about just talking about the color, the smell, and the taste of the whiskey. So I hope you guys found the video informative, or at the very least interesting. I hope you like what I'm doing with the channel here. Like I said, this is definitely not going to take the place of beer reviews. This will be a very occasional thing, but I very occasionally like to enjoy Scotch sometimes. So that's all for now. Stay tuned for the next Scotch review, where we're going to start off with my favorite Highland Park 12-year-old whiskey. Anyway, we'll see you in the next video.